Okay, question strategy. So this is the other sort of concept, and again, this is kind of like don't panic. This is one of those ones that's going to sound like I'm being silly, but it's actually hugely important. When you get a question, the thing that you're answering, you're not answering the question, you are answering what you think NCARB and AIA think the answer should be. Right? Now that sounds sort of ridiculous, and it's kind of a court, like every exam is like that, right? Like if you're in college and you take an exam, of course you're answering what you think the professor wants you to answer, right? But this is one of those situations where it's quite literally that. Many of you will have been out in the field for a couple of years, maybe many years, and you may have a lot of experience doing things in a way that is not the sort of classic AIA NCARB way to do something. For example, you go on a job site and you see a dangerous trip hazard or something. You might say, hey, that's a bad idea. Somebody's going to trip on that thing. Well, technically, you just absorbed all of the liability on the job site for site safety, which is the GC's liability. So from an NCARB standpoint, if there's any question about site safety, the answer is, I see nothing, I know nothing, it's not my place. That's the GC's place. It is not me as the architect's place to say anything about that. Now it might be subtly more complicated than that, but it won't be much more complicated because they are really trying to make that point that that's the contractor's world. So the question is not how we do it or how I learned or what would be the smartest thing in order to keep everybody safe or anything like that. The question is, what does NCARB think the right answer would be for this one, right? It's a hugely important aspect to kind of how to start thinking about what's going on. And then a couple other quick things to say about kind of question strategy. One, I'm not going to go deep into it, but one of the things that was very interesting, we talked to NCARB quite a while ago, about a year or so ago, and they talked about this triangle of sort of different aspects of how questions are thought through. And the big part of the triangle is just stuff that, like memorization, factoids, how many inches are in a foot, right? So yeah, we'll call that F for factoids. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's more about, okay, it's not a factoid, but it's about sort of the ability to understand a situation. So you've got kind of a level of saying, all right, here's some information. I understand what this stuff is. It's a little more complicated. It's not just a straight memorization thing. It's a bit more complicated, but something that I have to sort of know multiple pieces of information to really be able to understand. And then there's another level, which is kind of more like analysis. They use a couple different terms, but I'm going to call it analysis, where it's not just that I understand these things, but I have to be able to do something with it. I have to be able to say, all right, I understand this and I understand that, and now we're making a priority between them and we're choosing one or we're combining them together in some way. There's something that I'm doing with that information, right? So you can imagine questions which are, how big is an acre? Something like that. Well, that's a factoid type question. You can imagine questions that are about understanding. It's sort of about, here's a situation with a certain kind of building and here's a HVAC system. Does that HVAC system seem to make sense for that building? Or in an earthquake, does this building shape, does it make sense in this context? Right, that's sort of about understanding. But then there's this sort of analysis where I'm taking those kinds of questions where it's saying, all right, we know there's the earthquake, what should we do about it? Now we're actually kind of analyzing it and going through it more deeply. So supposedly, they're kind of have gotten rid of all of the factoid type questions. I think that's probably not totally true, but essentially, it used to be filled with little things and people would come out complaining like, wait, I have to know, some random, that a fathom is 6 feet in order to become a licensed architect. That doesn't make any sense. And so they've kind of removed those things, and they're really focused on these two. You may have noticed that I left off the top and this is the create. That's where kind of design is, right? And you'll notice that I'm not talking about that one, and I'm not talking about the factoids. All the questions are really going to be in this analysis and understanding zone. So it's important to sort of grasp that that's really the key. They're not going to ask you to really design anything. Anything that you're going to have to think about from a design standpoint is really more of an analysis type question. So don't fret about it. You kind of understand where these questions are coming from. Think about the strategy from that standpoint and what the NCARB folks are really looking for as an answer. All right, we're going to talk real quick about some question types while we're talking about question strategy. There are 3 types of new questions under the 5.0 compared to the 4.0. The old exam, which is either already dead or is about to be, is it still going?
Thank you, Mike. That's a perfect time for my public service announcement, which is that ARE 4.0 is almost done on June 30th. That's the last day for ARE 4.0.
Yeah,
thank you. That's my public service announcement for today. Wish you all the best of luck.
So the 4.0 is dying. If you haven't started your exams, it doesn't matter anyway. It's dead to you already. It's just for people who had started in it. So in 4.0, we had multiple choice, regular kinds of questions, individual questions, and then a series of vignettes, which were these complicated drawing things that would take 10, 15, 20 minutes, sometimes up to an hour and a half. So there were these sort of computer drawings in these sort of odd ways. The vignettes were always a little weird. They got rid of those, and they said, this isn't really, the vignettes aren't really terribly good at depicting life as an architect. And so they came up with the hotspot, the Dragon Place, and then the case study. Now, we talk about case studies elsewhere, but the gist of the case study, I'm just going to talk about real quick, is let's say you get 80 questions. So you've got a whole bunch of individual, regular, multiple choice questions. And then maybe I get 15 case study questions. So this is the case study. And what that means is there's a series of information, sort of tabs, that are associated with that case study. So maybe it's a piece of code, maybe it's a detail, maybe it's some information from what the owner is interested in, maybe it's something about the zoning, something like, who knows what the question could be about anything. So there's a general scenario for each case study. And then there's a series of questions that regard that general scenario. You might have one case study, you might have 2 case studies. I think these days there's a lot of 2s, but I think that's because they're testing some of those case studies out. So you can start here and go through all of these individual questions and then get to the case study. If you want, you can jump ahead and go straight to the case study, and then when you're done, go back and do the individual questions. Either way is totally fine. Whatever works for you is, you want to, while you're taking your first couple of exams, you want to be thinking about how you like to do it. Now, if it was me, I would just start at the beginning and go. And the reason for that is one of the dangers of the case study is some of that information might be actually quite lengthy. And it's a situation where you're not expected to read it from beginning to end. You might get 40 pages of code or something like that, but you are expected to use it. And if you start with that, my worry, this is what I would do, this is why I'm worried about it, if I was in this situation, what I would do is I'd start finding myself reading information that I don't need to know. And so suddenly I'd be halfway through the exam and I've only done the 15 questions that are in the case study. So for me, I would just start with that first bunch of individual questions, however many they are, and just blast through those. And then with the time I have left, kind of use that. If I have 40 minutes left for those last 15, well, okay, now I know how much time I have to spend going through the information. I can be more strategic about it. So that's how I would do it. But like I said, test it out for yourself and try doing it your way.
And one other thought here that I know your kind of assumption you're working off of is just to remind everyone, every question is weighted exactly the same.
Yeah.
So a case study is not worth more a case study question is not worth more than a regular question. So why spend, why get lost in a way, trying to get the case studies right? Just get all the 80 and get the majority of the questions knocked out, and then you'll have some time for the case studies.
Exactly, yeah. So, and the numbers are going to be for a case study anywhere from probably 10 or 12 up to like 20, 22 or something. My guess is that most of them will probably be about 15 to 12 to 15, something like that. I think they're still deciding whether they're going to have fewer questions per case study and then multiple case studies, or whether they're going to have more questions. Like they're testing out a bunch of different possibilities in this first couple of years of 5.0. So that's case study. That's kind of replacing the vignettes. But then there's these other two, the hotspot and the drag in place. Now we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're going to do a quick little sort of experimental thing here, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So here's an example of a question that is a hotspot type question. So up here.
And actually just one note here. So this is actually from our Black Spectacles practice exams, which is designed to look and feel just like the real exam. In fact, we worked with NCARB to make sure that we had to use the same plugins and had the same user interface, so that highlight, strike through, calculator references, all that stuff at the top, including what Mike's about to show you, is literally the same web technology, so it should look and feel the same.
Yeah, and you'll get a question. So up here, the question is, identify the top of the hill on the topographical survey. So clearly what it's trying to get across here is we have 460 here, we have 475, so this is 460, 465, 470, 475. Now, on the exam, the real exam, my guess is they would actually always have, on a topography, they would have all of the numbers. But if they didn't, you would be able to know, like they wouldn't, it wouldn't be 460 and then 460 again, and then, like they're not going to trick you in some way, right? This is telling you kind of what's going on. So the question is, where is the top of the hill? Well, there's no way we can be, 100% sure where the top of the hill is. We don't need to be 100% sure. The point of this drag and drop is not that there is a single point that is exactly right. It's that there's an area that is in the zone of correctness, right? And so quite obviously, here's the top of the hill. So we have this last of the contour lines. And so if we put our top of the hill exactly right just inside that contour line, that's probably not right, because it's probably taller more towards the center. It probably goes up and then back down. So technically, we're right next to the contour is probably not right. But if you put it anywhere in this sort of central zone, you're going to be right. And on our version of things, it's actually going to tell you right away. And there it is down at the bottom where it says correct. So you can kind of see, like, as soon as you make a choice, you can see that. Unfortunately, they're not going to do that on the actual exam. That's just to help you sort of through the process. So that's a drag and drop. And one of the things I like about this example is that it sort of gives you that sense of, all right, anything in that area, like you don't have to spend time like measuring where the exact center is or anything. That's not the point. They just want to make sure you understand what topography means, right? That's really the basic idea of it. Now, one of the things you have to be a little careful about is if, you could easily have a situation that implies a certain thing, and then it turns out there's another number up here, which is now implying that this is actually like a pool in the top, not a mound at the top. So you got to be a little careful about those kinds of things. Let's look at the other one. So that was drag and drop. This one, we're going to actually, in this case, the question is, so I'm sorry, that was not drag and drop. That was, what's the name of the other one?
Click and place or something?
Something like that. I'm
forget what
sorry.
it's called.
I totally blew that. But we'll get back to it. You'll see the correct name. Apologies. Moving fast here. So in this one, we have, in this case, a series of pieces of information. In this case, they're words, but it could be like a piece of flashing, or it could be a steel angle, or it could be a solar panel on a site plan. There's any number of different things. In this case, it's words, and we're going to drag them into the appropriate spot. this case, the question is drag and drop the labels into the corresponding location on the diagram of the weld. So this is a weld, so it means there's a piece of presumably steel here and a piece of steel here. And the question is, what are all of these components? And you have to take a look at what you have as a possibility. Now, the key ones here, that one right there is the key one. That's the one that really talks about how strong a weld is. That's actually the throat. So we're going to throw that right there. And then we've got a couple of other possibilities here. This one is the one that we see, and therefore it's the face. And then we have leg and neck left. Well, interestingly, not all of these have to be used, and that one's going to be leg, and then that one's going to be leg as well. And look at that, we got it correct. So you can see this is a little bit more complicated, a little bit more movement, but it's still very simple. There's still, even if it's something like you're going to place the solar panel, and the whole point of that is that you're not putting the solar panel in the shadow of the building next door or whatever it is, right? There's going to be a number of places, a relatively wide circle of spots where you could put it, or it's going to be relatively simple in concept like this one is. So don't overthink it. These are relatively simple ways to answer questions. The rest of the questions are just going to be the standard, like here's a question and here's A, B, C, and D as possible answers. There's a few fill in the blanks. Those will almost always be numbers. I think always be numbers. So there's a couple of different types of questions, but for the most part, most of the questions will be in that kind of fairly standard way.